Hi there, Care Prevention, and welcome to our first of 3 videos concerning concussion. And as we said before in the modular introduction video, this is a series of catastrophic and potentially catastrophic injuries that occur in athletics. And so in this video, we are starting with the description or the definition of what a concussion is, and then we're going to talk about how it occurs. So what I have here is a diagram of the human brain sitting inside the skull, and what we see is how the human brain comes down, and then this is the cerebellum here, which is kind of the smaller part of the brain, and then it extends down into the spinal cord. And the brain and spinal cord themselves both make up the central nervous system. And so as we go through, what we want to understand is that the brain and the spinal cord are very intimately connected here around the neck, and that'll be more important when we get into the next module, which discusses cervical spine injury in the athlete. So the first thing that we want to talk about here is how a concussion happens. And there are several ways that a concussion can happen, and what I would urge you to remember is that concussions can happen in ways that we really don't always anticipate, and that is down here on the indirect letter C. But the most common ways that concussions happen are through coup and contra coup injuries. And in your text, it really works on the word contra coup, but I also want you to understand the word coup. And so if you would look at the diagram of the human brain here, a coup injury and a contra coup injury indicate that there was some kind of a trauma present to the head. Now, what we really want to kind of focus here on is trauma specific to impact from a fall or from an object causing blunt trauma to the head. And so if a person were to fall, they would hit one side of their head, and just for good measure here, we'll say that a person falls backwards and they're going to hit the back of their head. So a coup injury would mean that that person fell backwards and the brain literally traveled in that same direction and slaps the posterior or the back side of the skull on the inside. And when that happens, there is bruising and bleeding just like there would be if you fell and hit your elbow. So a coup is the same side as impact. A contra coup is a little bit different. And a contra coup is interesting because it indicates that there was some intense physics occurring. That person fell backwards, they hit their head on impact, but the fall was so quick and the physics and the centrifugal force were so overpowering that the brain literally transmitted forward and hits the front side of the skull because of the physics. And so we call that a contra coup injury. And the reason it is important to understand coup and contra coup is because typically the athlete can tell you a lot about the injury once it's happened, even though they are concussed, and they can tell you that they fell backwards, hit the back of their head, but they have pain in the front of their head. And so that tells us that they were victim to quite a powerful hit. Sometimes they'll just report that the pain happens to be on the same side as the trauma was, but if they tell you that it's on the opposite side, then you immediately know that there was some strong physics involved in the hit that they took. The next thing that I want to talk about is symptoms or symptomology and signs of a concussion. And on timeout 9.1 in your textbook in chapter 9, it talks about the signs and symptoms. And the clinical picture is very ambiguous of concussions and typically never the same. You'll see a long list of symptoms that occur when a concussion happens. And those range from the headache, which is almost of all concussions, all the way to post-traumatic amnesia, to a loss of consciousness, to dizziness. But throughout that whole list, what you'll need to know is that any one or more of those symptoms could occur in the clinical manifestation of a concussion incident. And so what we know is that with that series of symptoms that occurs, we need to be able to examine in our assessment of this injury, which is in the next video, we need to examine each one of those symptoms and ask about those symptoms. So one of the things that we see in the clinical picture is that most symptoms of a concussion will resolve in about 10 days. Now, I'm not saying that a concussion lasts 10 days. I'm not saying that a concussion won't last 10 days. What I'm saying is that most concussions according to your textbook, resolve within 10 days, at least the symptoms of the concussion resolve. And that's kind of an important thing to acknowledge, that just because the symptoms of the concussion are gone does not mean that that person is healed. Now, what we want to kind of take into consideration here is that we have injured our brain. And I would tell you that a concussion occurs on every played-on football field every Friday night to some degree, and we just don't always catch it as coaches, athletic trainers, and parents. And the hard thing to do is to validate a concussion by simply saying, well, this kid has a headache. Coaches are very quick to appreciate a person who has a sprained ankle, and they can visibly see the swelling and the deformity that occurs from a sprained ankle. But if I tell a coach, listen, this kid can't participate because he has a headache, well, that seems to have a little less weight when an injury or potential injury is present with an athlete. And so we're talking about a brain injury, most commonly identified by the symptom of headache after trauma. And then we look at this letter C down here and we say, well, we talked about this indirect trauma. What else could possibly happen? Well, and I need to tell you that there are injuries that can occur to the brain just by simple movements of the neck, or a person is hit and their head never really makes contact with another player, another apparatus of the game, or even the field. And so it's just because the physics are so great that they have that contact in the brain with the skull. And so a good example of this is, for a very long time we thought that all athletes needed, or not all athletes, but athletes in collision sports needed to wear a mouth guard, and we still do that. But the mouth guard was originally designed to kind of reduce the idea or the risk of concussion. And what we found is that we can't verify that with the data. A mouth guard is very important. It protects the inner mouth and the teeth, which you only get one set of, so that's kind of an important thing. But the other side of that is, does it reduce the risk of concussion? The data doesn't prove that it does, but I will tell you, as a clinical pearl, I do believe that it does, because of the impacts that could occur at the jaw and ultimately could transmit into the brain. So there are several symptoms that we do want to identify. Again, that headache, the dizziness, do they have a loss of consciousness? And I'll address that in the assessment in the next video. But also, do they have amnesia? Are they foggy? Do they have ringing in their ears? Are they sick at their stomach? What are these things occurring that we need to document? And that's everything, because we need to know how they are persisting. To kind of end the definition of concussion, I wanted to point out three very critical things out of your text, and that is post-concussion syndrome. There's a video down below, our 3 videos here, that talks about post-concussion syndrome, but this is where symptoms persist after we know that the concussion itself has healed, and these symptoms can progress for months, even years after the injury, depending upon how many injuries they've had and to what extent or to how serious they were. Another incident that we want to identify is second impact syndrome. Again, another video to follow the post-concussion syndrome video is second impact syndrome. And this is a video that identifies, or this is a syndrome that is identified when someone has returned to sports and has another concussion after they have not healed from the first one. This is typically an injury that we don't see a lot, because most cases of second impact syndrome are terminal and they die. There are a few people who survive that, and that video below is a story of one of them. And then the last thing on our list here is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And this is a word that's really being brought up now, specifically in the National Football League and with boxing. And it's a condition that we have to diagnose after a person dies, and so it's post-mortem, and they evaluate the brain. And you're going to see another video about CTE, and then ultimately you're going to watch another video. There's 4 videos down below this after the 3 that we do on the concussion. But this 4th video talks about what CTE is, as well as how they identify it. You can see pictures of brains post-mortem, but also in diagnostics, and see changes that I have identified because of chronic traumatic injury. So this is our concussion profile. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how we assess a concussion and what to do during the assessment. Hope to see you then.